Today I'm doing a mountain or like a hillside view on mounted UArt paper, which is a really different paper than the paper that I'd used in my previous video. And as always, this is what I always do, and that is to lay down my basic shapes with a hard pastel. And I'm not really concerned about detail, it's just the rudimentary shapes. How do my light and my darks relate to one another, and how does it affect the overall landscape? How does it relate to one another, and how can I use that as a roadmap to go forward? And once I'm done with the hard pastel, I generally go in with a softer pastel and I start putting down layers and add definition. And I like a nice blue sky, so I'm doing a nice blue sky. I'm going in with these beautiful ochre colors that I have. This is, if you're interested, this is the Red Rocks set from Terry Ludwig. I had it lying around and I hadn't used it yet, and it just begged me to do a painting with it, hence this painting. And even now, as you can tell, I'm layering down my initial area. I'm starting to give definition, just little bits of shadow, little bits of light, but I'm not going in and giving you exact precise details yet. That comes later. And foliage is always a fun thing or a tricky thing, whichever one suits you best. But don't be afraid to use colors like purple and blue for your foliage as well. I do that a lot. I like to repeat my colors, and whatever color I'm using for shadows in different areas, I like to bring that into my foliage, as you can tell. And you don't always have to define everything. That is another thing that I cannot stress enough. I'm not really defining the area of separation between where the grass sometimes anchors into the rock and where the rock starts. So a good tip is to always leave a little bit for the viewer to interpret, but that's just something that I feel always strengthens a painting. So I'm still going in and I'm starting to give definition to some of the foliage, but I'm still working on the larger scheme of things. I'm still looking at it as a whole rather than certain areas that I need to focus on. I'm going in and I'm adding foliage that is in the foreground, and I always try to figure out how do I go and distinguish foliage in the foreground to the foliage in the background, because otherwise it just becomes this huge giant blob of green or color. And one really good way to do that is to realize that, or at least that I have found useful, is to make my contrast in the foreground much more obvious than it is in the background. My background foliage always has a little bit of purple in it. I find that to be a really awesome color to mute down contrast or to give it that hazy effect of distance. And I really, really, really like that. And I use purple throughout my foliage in all my paintings. And another thing to always look out for and something to work towards is sky holes. They are something that I always found them tricky. It's tricky to get realistic looking sky holes, so pay attention to your reference photo. Just pay attention to the shapes and try and replicate that shape rather than what you think that you see. And it might seem like something very rudimentary and obvious, but it's actually a really good skill to acquire. And I'm going in and defining the rocks here too. There's a lot of detail in the rocks, but I'm choosing not to get too tied down by it currently. I'm sorry if the video skipped a little bit. I did not finish this in one sitting, so quarantine means I have a lot of things to do. So I do stop often and get back onto my painting. So as you can tell, I like to give purple and lavender to the background foliage. It's one of my favorite things to do. And some of my painting is also outside the frame, and I apologize for that. I'm still getting the hang of this thing, but it's still the basics. It is laying down my darks and then adding on the lights on top of that. And I'm now adding in sky holes, and it's a really, really great idea to practice sky holes on a different paper, just so that you get the hang of it, because sometimes they can be really frustrating, especially if you're starting out, but they really add a sense of lightness and lightful. And another thing that you want to pay attention to, jump in subject, is that you want to get the small little details that are there. You want to give highlights even in the dark. As you can tell that I've done sunlight, you want to pay attention to the sunlight. Sunlight doesn't just leave completely. There's always variations in the darkness. You don't want it to be a completely flat bit of dark expanse. You want to make even the darks interesting. So I put in little reflections of light, little bits of light that fall over there. Sometimes I mute them, like I'm doing now. Sometimes I let them be. And another thing that you shouldn't be afraid to do is really just kind of use the colors that you have. For example, I'm using straight up orange on and red on the leaves, and I like it. I don't think that there's anything to shy away from. So don't be scared to be adventurous with your colors, and don't be scared to take risks with adding color to the paintings. I like doing that. For example, right now I'm putting in foliage, and the foliage has a lot of purple in it, and it's not something that you would normally think, but I think it's one of the most beautiful things to do, to add a lavender to the background. It's my favorite trick to distinguish between background and foreground. And it's, as always, sometimes we make mistakes, and you go in and you clean it up and see what you can do with that. And don't be afraid to use the actual pastel. The stick, I like to break really long pastels. I like to use the actual pastel to create texture and shape. So depending on how you hold it, you can create certain strokes. And so for right now, I'm just using the very slight edge of it to create delicate strokes, and you can create large patterns in it as well. And when you're creating highlights, make sure that your highlights are not too bright. That's one thing that is a common mistake. I used to do that all the time as well. My highlights would just be too bright. Sometimes I go in and add a little bit more color into my highlights to create a little bit of muted brightness. You want to make sure that the light isn't too light and doesn't give you too much. It's not too much of an attention grabbing thing, but we are almost done. And I'm just going in and finishing up the painting. And here you have it. I hope you enjoyed this little paint with me, and I hope you learned something. See you next time.